Hello and welcome back to the second season of the EduPulse podcast. Feel free to sit back and enjoy our conversations with leading educational thinkers, movers and shakers, with a keen focus on helping our ITT and ECT colleagues navigate the choppy waters of education. This week, we're joined by Head of Teaching and Learning and Head of Psychology, Paul Cline. We chat all things instructional coaching, mental models and rehearsal, and so much other stuff along the way. Well, hello everybody, welcome back. Hello Adam, how are you?
Living the absolute dream of just having moved into a flat and currently living in a bomb site with a kitchen that is like evolving into a working kitchen day by day. But all of that is like shelved in my mind for the next hour or so because this is super exciting this morning, isn't it?
Well, do you want to introduce our very exciting guest for today?
We have got Mr. Drumroll please, Paul Cline.
Woohoo! Welcome, Paul.
Good morning, thank you.
And we're gonna dig into all things instructional coaching, which is exactly what we're all thinking about on a Saturday morning at 8 o'clock with the birds beginning to wake up and all that kind of stuff. So, yeah, I'm excited to get into it. Are you ready and primed to go, Paul?
Yeah, I think so. I'm still waking up, but I'm sure we'll be fine.
Listen, that's the thing. We are here. Our listening audience don't know it's 8 a.m. Unless they're really clued in and they've just listened. We are just here to have a really good chat. So we will guide your hand through this well-trodden path now in our second season of our EduPulse podcast and instructional coaching. As we kind of move forward with all this evolved thinking that is happening right now, Paul, you'll get to know that I'm kind of like the opposite of everything we're about to be speaking about. I've not been coached. I'm not a coach. So all of this to me is kind of brand new. And as I evolve with it, so too hopefully will our listeners, and we can really get into what it's about. So thank you so much for joining us this morning.
Thank you. I mean, I know that you had Jim Knight on, not that long ago, so I feel slightly intimidated by who's come before. But
we will be analysing both episodes side by side.
Yeah,
absolutely.
He's not on the phone, is he?
Think of it as standing on the shoulders of giants.
Yes, exactly.
He is waiting in judgment.
No, it's really cool. And I think just before we launch in as well, I think it's super important to say the whole EduPulse ethos is about broadening the conversation, right? And trying to bring more people into the conversation around different things. And Chris day to day doesn't run coaching sessions. That's not a major part of his role, but he's also got a really interesting insight into this thinking. And we think that just generally sometimes there can be a bit of a barrier to people feeling I haven't really got the right to say anything about that thing because I don't do it day in, day out. But everybody that has a view on this stuff is totally welcome to contribute. And so we're really proud to sort of model that as well, I guess. So should we dive in then? Paul, do you want to just tell us what's your story?
Cool. Yeah. Okay. So I work in Ipswich School in the lovely Suffolk, and I'm a psychology teacher, and that's my sort of background. So I started teaching in 2005, having done psychology degree and then a postgrad degree. Sort of kind of fell into teaching a little bit, like quite a lot of people really, because I wasn't quite sure what to do and someone suggested it, and I thought, well, I'll give it a try, and then enjoyed it and kind of carried on. And I guess quite a pivotal moment for me in that early on was that I had a mentor when I was in NQT, obviously nowadays ECT, who very much sort of embodied the evidence-informed approach. Although back then no one really used that term, and evidence-based was kind of even then was still quite a new term. And so something he encouraged in our regular mentor meetings was reading, and kept throwing bits of journals or books at me and things like that. And I guess that sort of stuck with me throughout my career that I've always been interested in going, oh, let's go and read some more about this. Let's dive into the literature. And I suppose that sort of then eventually set me up for where I am now, which is, so once I was a head of department at my current school, and then the opportunity to be in charge of teaching and learning came up. I was already kind of working as part of the teaching and learning team at that point. And so that's where I am now. So I run teaching and learning. So I'm in charge of CPD. I lead on coaching. So we've got a small sort of still coaching program that has a couple of different strands to it in our school. And I do other kind of all aspects of teacher professional development, as well as sort of continuing a bit of psychology teaching as I, in the background as well. So that's kind of where I am now. Our school has taken quite a sort of big leap in about the last 4 or 5 years in terms of the direction we've gone with professional development. In the past, so we had sort of quite a traditional model of formal observations that were graded. These were linked to some sort of performance management review. We had a performance management system itself that was, well, to be honest, fairly toothless and not didn't really achieve a lot. You set some targets on a yearly basis that no one ever really talked about or looked at except 5 minutes before the meeting. And we had a CPD program where it was kind of an optional twilight model where the same 8 or 10 people would turn up on a regular basis. There was, the occasional standalone inset day thing, big bang, let's pay a lot of money to get somebody in, talk at everyone for 2 hours. Everyone comes out going, wow, that was great. And nothing changed. So we've made some quite significant structural and sort of cultural changes around that in terms of getting rid of formal observations, moving our CPD and making it more of an entitlement for everybody. So everybody gets it. Once a term, they get an afternoon off timetable to attend CPD, and there's time within that to try and discuss it in subjects, things like that. We've introduced various types of coaching, so a kind of formal coaching program, which is, I guess, what we'll talk about more in a minute, the sort of cycle of observation feedback, but also a less intense kind of drop-in approach as well to lesson observation for all the other members of staff, plus a appraisal system which is much more about kind of developmental targets sort of on an ongoing basis. So again, trying to take some of that coaching ethos into that realm as well, so it's kind of hopefully all ties up. So that's kind of where we are now, and so far it seems to be having a positive impact, and we feel like certainly in the last year or so it's gaining a lot more traction. People are starting to talk in the T&L vernacular, I suppose, and appraisal is seen as a positive thing rather than just a bit of bureaucracy and another bit of paper to chase, and people are appreciating the power of coaching and formative feedback in a way that just wasn't happening before.
Well, I think Adam will be the first person to say, as he has in a couple of other episodes, that even in his school they spent an entire year just focusing on shared language and building up that vocabulary. You see, Adam, I do listen. And these things these things take time to embed, and it's so impressive that your school has given over the time and the resource in whatever that looks like to ensure the ring fence time for staff and even your position. So it just sounds absolutely sounds
well.
Awesome.
I think that's really important to emphasise as well, that I feel very, very lucky that you're right, that the school was willing to invest in that, because I kind of came up with this grand plan and said, look, this is how I think this could work, and I think this would be brilliant, and and I really thought through a lot of the detail, but there was a very good chance I could have sat down with the head and the deputy and they'd just gone, no, we haven't got, we're not spending the money on that. That's we're not going to go with that model. You're going to have to come up with something else. So I feel very privileged that that's happening. But I also know that there's lots of schools around the country who are trying to do similar kinds of things and think flexibly and say, well, how can we make this work? Because we think this is a priority. And I think that's what it comes down to is if you think it's enough of a priority, you'll find a solution with whatever fits your context. If it's not, then it won't happen. So I think that was probably the biggest part, was convincing those at the top and those who ultimately get to make those decisions that this was something that was worth doing, and that there was a problem to solve. So there was quite a lot of work in the background, kind of data gathering on that kind of thing, and doing reading to say like, this is why we need to move forward on this.
Do you know, there's a couple of things that like really come out really strongly there. So like the first thing is like it's dynamic. So like there's more than one way of doing coaching and doing instructional coaching, and actually it's about trying to match the model that you use to the needs of your context and to like the purpose that you want your coaching program to serve. So yeah, it sounds like you're really tuned into that sort of dynamism aspect of it. And then the second thing that comes through is like it's a mindset. And for example, like Chris is a great example of this. So while okay, Chris would say I don't do coaching and I haven't been coached, I know some conversations that he's started to have with some of his team, because anecdotally we talk about our jobs with each other, and like that there is definitely a coaching mindset there. And everything, a lot of what you've just said there, Paul, is about like trying to adopt a coaching mindset in everything that you do across the school. And I think that it's so important, because otherwise the bottom just falls out of this stuff. So you talk there about appraisal. If you're saying, right, instructional coaching is the way that we're going to develop our teachers, and we're going to absolutely commit to that, and you have this really great instructional coaching program, and everyone's invested in it, and you're allocating time for it, but then you've essentially got an appraisal system that goes, we're still going to come and judge your teaching as well, but that's the judgment bit, or that's the evaluation bit. I hear this a lot, actually. That's the evaluation bit. We've got to do that, and then the development bit happens over here. It's like, well, you just can't do that, because they're not two completely distinct and different activities. They're all part of the same thing, which is teachers interacting with getting better at their job. And you've got to have a set and agreed mindset to that, right?
Yeah, totally. I think that was probably one of the biggest things that underpinned the whole model that we went with, was just that idea of alignment, and that everything has to join up. So the CPD, the inset, those are inputs. The coaching and the drop-ins and things like that, they provide more inputs. The appraisal adds a layer of accountability to that, but not in a, like you say, a judgmental, evaluative way. There's no judging at all on ours. There's no real requirement for like lots of evidence. It's just adding a layer of like discussion around, okay, well, what are you working on? Why are you working on that? How are you working on it? How's it going? How can I support you with that? And I think that's probably one of the things that's happened this year that's had a shift as well, that's helping this whole process, is that, to start with, so the way our appraisal system works is that most people, their appraiser is their academic head of department, so their subject lead, and they have an appraisal conversation once a term where they look at just one specific target based around classroom teaching. And the quality of those conversations are across the school was just so variable and inconsistent. I lead on a few of them. So heads of department then get appraised by either me or other members of SMT. And the quality across the board there was just so different. And we've tried really hard to kind of model better what does a good appraisal conversation look like, because in some courses it was just a case of someone going, right, write me down a target. Yeah, that's great. Or I think you should work on this. Write that down. And actually modeling the, what's going well. Tell me about that. What's working? Okay, what do you want to, is there something around that you want to improve? How might you improve that? What's that going to look like? What's the purpose? All those sorts of questions you'd have in a coaching session. That's been really important to get that into that model, so that, like you say, it's the ethos, it's the mindset that everyone's working on, even if they're not doing coaching.
And like, I know for absolute certain that in Chris's mind right now, he's going, I want to talk about our approach to appraisal at my school, because it is absolutely brilliant. And I know like he's invested tons and tons into it. But if I just say one other thing, and then it'd be great to hear about Chris's approach as well, because like I say, it's brilliant. I think there's a really big thing there around, like, quite often with appraisal, I think we end up looking at it as a task that needs to be completed, which then lends itself to this thinking of, right, let's choose a target that we can measure, like, without having to do anything extra outside of like the data that's already being produced within school, which then means that essentially we end up with targets that can all be measured in, or we think can all be measured by outcome data.
Yeah.
And the problem with that is that, life just doesn't work like that. Teaching certainly doesn't work like that. And if we can get to a point where actually we go, this is the really important thing, and like we really believe this is the thing that this person should be working on. And when I say we, I don't mean SLT. I mean me and that person in the room. We agree this is the most powerful thing for them to be working on. That's going to be their target, and actually we'll find a way to measure that. But really, the measure is about them being able to say, oh, hey, yeah, look, I have actually developed that. I have actually improved on that. And that's, for things like self-efficacy, that's so important to be able to say, yeah, I've had this thing to work on and I've worked on it, and I can see some evidence there that it's got better. And often that can include like narrative forms of data, which are just so underused within schools, right? We're constantly looking for often quantitative, but really easily interpretable data. What we don't do enough of is go, okay, we've got this sample of things that people are saying who come into contact with this person. So be it colleagues, be it students, these are the things that people are saying. Let's try and tease out some really key themes here, and we'll use those themes as our data points to kind of reflect on the progress that this person has made in this particular area. It's much harder to do. It's potentially more time consuming to do. My word, it's so much more powerful, like so much more powerful.
It's also like it just narrows down that chain between cause and effect. Like that's what we're trying to figure out, aren't we? We're trying to say, if we do this, this happens. And you can go like, if you're going to change, I don't know, this particular element of your practice, like your classroom questioning, what's the evidence that that's working? Well, you can kind of get the qualitative data from classrooms, the teacher's observation, the student's observations, that sort of stuff. And it's quite direct. If you start trying to scale that up and say, well, we're going to measure that in terms of outcomes on these assessments, well, there's so much other noise and other stuff in the way between those two things that it's impossible to kind of attribute any one that thing to that thing. So you would just end up going, well, I think it worked, don't really know. Whereas if you focus on, like what's actually there, you can kind of, and then you just have to trust that over time, all of that is going to contribute ultimately to those more hard outcome measures. But there is an element of like a bit of a leap of faith in there, isn't there?
Yeah, and like there's an attribution effect there as well that's really important to think about. It's like, from motivation theory tells us that people have got to be able to attribute the success to the actions that they've taken to continue taking those actions. And like you just touched on that there with that mention of attribution. Chris, do you want to tell us about your approach to appraisal? And then we haven't even got to instructional coaching yet, have we? This is great.
It's really so very privileged to work with my head teacher, who also founded the school. And when you've started a school from scratch, there are some things you do because you think you should. We are a small independent school, but we choose to be what would the word be? I suppose it's inspected, trying to be clever, inspected by Ofsted. Regulated, that would be it. So we choose to be regulated by Ofsted simply because they're about £2,500 cheaper per inspection than other competing bodies. And so, we were finding we were doing things just because, and we were beginning to realise that in a school of our size, that teacher agency was linked to teacher efficacy in an almost kind of umbilical way. And so to be able to be going around a classroom saying, I'm going to come and observe you now, just didn't work. It's too it's too imprisoning of the teacher. They in a small school like ours, we were able to use the fact that we're in and around the whole time. You can hear things almost immediately. It's a Victorian manor house, so things echo. You can hear almost instantly if there's shouting in the room. We can be there quite quickly to find out what's going on. So learning walks don't particularly happen because they happen automatically if I'm walking down the corridor. There was no point naming these things. And actually, the agency came from us going to the teachers and going, right, we're scrapping observations and we are going to have a cycle, but the cycle's we're just going to call it come and see. And we're just going to name it because codifying things is cool. I'm yet to convince my head teacher of that because Sally is very much an advocate of it's just kind of a sheep in wolf's clothing that was around 10 years ago. You've just named it something else. It's always been around. But she puts up with my geeking.
One of them. Yeah.
Yeah. But the thing is, she's absolutely right. When for a period of time when SPAG became GPS, I think she might have created a small earthquake in Birmingham. It's just like, it's ridiculous. Why are we renaming it? And I can't disagree with her. She's absolutely right. But basically, the system is the teacher comes to us and says, I would like you to come see this lesson because I'm either really proud of it or I'd like you to help me with something. And that's the basis of it. And because of that, we rarely get, come and see this because I'm proud. What we actually get, because of the ability for them to choose, is, you come and see this because I'm struggling. Because hopefully we've built up that culture of trust, and that efficacy is linked to agency. And so working with one of our teachers at the moment, spoke about him last time in the previous episode, and he's just gone, I'm really proud of this, but I'm struggling here. And we've been having a couple of conversations. I sit down and model what I think is potentially a coaching conversation on everything. I've been working with Adam for so long now, just asking him questions. What do you think went well? How do you, what do you think didn't go so well, and what do you think needs to change? And I guess we've had a lot of improvement very, very quickly, including a complete change around in his classroom. Because one of the things we spotted straight away, he was like, I feel really uncomfortable. And that's because there's no room for you to walk around in. So the other day, he just it's a house, right? So it's a Victorian house. So there's very little in way of infrastructure you can change on the walls and stuff. But he did, and now his classroom is open and psychologically freer, and it's just brilliant. And that's all come about from hopefully an appraisal process that means that once we've done the come and see, they've invited feedback, because they've shown that they're psychologically safe enough to go help, and then we offer the help. And that's kind of where we are at the moment. It's building up nice and slowly. We're building the language into it. We are a registered centre for the Independent Schools Teacher Training Programme. So we've got an ECT with us at the moment. So we're developing them in their NQT year, which is very exciting. We get to mould one of them in our own image.
Yes. with great power comes great responsibility, I suppose.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. But that's us, and I think there's something to be said in that for whatever happens and however coaching is presented to me, that the people who are being involved in that are feeling psychologically safe enough to be told what is wrong if they aren't able to figure it out themselves, I guess.
Awesome. All right, so we've said we're going to talk about instructional coaching, so
we probably ought to.
We better do a bit of that.
Yeah.
So but it is also super useful to, I think, set that framework of the culture of a couple of really key takeaways there. The culture of the school has got to be right if you want coaching to land, because if it's not psychologically safe as an organisation, then people aren't going to buy into the vulnerability that they need to for coaching to work. If you are looking at kind of trying to measure the impact or measure the effect of the work that you're doing around developing teachers, definitely consider using more narrative data, which is harder to interpret, might take you longer to interpret, but much richer and more powerful. And when you're thinking about teacher development in a general sense, it's got to be dynamic in the model that you choose. And we think, I think that instructional coaching is dynamic enough and is flexible enough in terms of how responsive it can be to the context of the moment and the context of the organisation, that it can be the answer to that dynamic challenge. So, for the purposes of this, because I know, Paul, when you answer this, there's going to be a ton of people start screaming at Twitter or any other social platform to go, no, that's the wrong thing to say, but we're going to do it anyway. What is our working definition of instructional coaching for the purposes of this chat? Let's see if we can do it with offending as fewer people as possible.
Oh, that's a challenge. Can we go the other way? Let's see if I can do it in a way that offends as many people as possible. So I think this is one of the, I'll get to an answer at some point, but it's one of those things that I don't think about on a regular basis. it doesn't. It almost doesn't matter to me that there's a definition that we agree on or not, because I feel like it ends up becoming the focus of the conversation rather than the actual, like, the important stuff. Does that make sense? Like, people can get so het up in arguing about, well, is this coaching or is this coaching or is this coaching? It doesn't matter in some respects. I think that there's an awful lot of time and energy been wasted on that, and a lot of quite proprietorial thinking, almost, or like, vocalizing about it, of like, no, that's not that thing and that's that thing, and that, we hold the keys to that idea that you're talking about, and I don't know, it feels like a lot of wasted energy on that. So I guess the simplest
Couldn't agree more.
way I would conceive it is it's a coach and a teacher working together to help solve problems that the teacher has in their teaching to help them get better. At its simplest level, that's it. The mechanisms underpinning that, it's got to be dynamic, I guess, to use that word again. That it's absolutely not top down. It's a collaborative process between the coach and the teacher, and that it's working together on problems that they think are important. The coach brings and shares expertise, but is not necessarily, like, always leading on that, depending on where the teacher is at with whatever they're trying to solve, whatever their context is. Is that generic, broad, and non-offensive enough?
I think there was a very clear undercurrent of chill out with that answer, which I think is nice. It's so,
rock on.
I think that's it's so important that, like, your point about the fact that we get really hung up on, like, what is coaching, what isn't coaching. You get people going, well, that's not coaching, that's mentoring. It's like, okay. Ultimately the key questions are, and this is just sort of paraphrasing what you said, really. So correct me if I'm wrong, or if there's anything else that you think we need to add into that. But, like, the key bits of it are, you got a coach and a teacher working together. So there's a partnership aspect of this, and that's really important. And that's where I think the trust bit comes in, and the psychological safety piece. So you've got a coach and a teacher working together to try and improve an aspect, like, so not the overall thing, but a really granular small aspect of the teacher's practice in a bid to improve the learning experience for students. So within that, it's got to be there's got to be a really powerful nature to the thing that's being focused on. So it's got to be the right thing. Within that, I think it's there's a bit there about, like, so it's got to be the right thing at the right time. So, and I think this is something that that Step Lab do really well, actually, is that there's a lot of I can't remember who wrote the blog, but there's a blog from one of the Step Lab team that essentially says, okay, like, if there's no point looking at teaching if behaviour is not nailed, there's no point looking at assessment if the teaching's not nailed. So there is a sort of hierarchy of sorts of, like, where should we focus our energies. And then the last bit, I suppose, is that there's got to be, like, buy-in and belief from both people within that partnership, coach and teacher, that, this is the thing that, A, we should be working on, but B, we really want to work on as well.
Yeah, I think that sums it up well. I think the interesting little, like, interplay there of the should and want to, because I think it depends where you are in your coaching relationship. Because, like, that idea of the hierarchy, that was something that I got introduced to really early on when I started learning about coaching and learning how to do it. Was that, culture of the room sort of trumps everything, and then this and whatever. So there's no point talking about assessment if the explanation isn't clear, because that's a more a bigger problem that's upstream. And I think that's really, really powerful thinking. My only caveat with that is that I think you might have to get to the right place with your teacher, with your coachee, to necessarily be able to go there. I think particularly early on in a coaching relationship, it might be appropriate to kind of dive into somewhere that maybe you think isn't the most powerful thing. And I think that comes back to the idea of, like, something that was sold to me, I suppose, early on, was this idea of the highest leverage action step. What's the thing that's going to have the biggest impact on learning? And I totally get that that's, in theory, that's a great idea. But sometimes the reality of it is that's not something that you can work on with that teacher at that particular moment. It might be because you haven't built that trust yet. It might be because you haven't built up like the fully developed understanding of how this coaching process works. It might be that they haven't kind of seen success with some changes that in other areas yet enough to fully believe in that process. It might be that upstream big thing is maybe too many steps too far away from their current mental model of practice, that you need to start something a bit closer to what they're comfortable with in order for them to go, yeah, okay, this process, I get it, this works, I'm seeing some outcomes of that, I'll let you in a bit more, let's delve a bit deeper. And I think that's really, really crucial. And I guess that brings it back to sort of some of the more recent discussions we've been having about the importance of mental models and surfacing those, because you've kind of got to see where they are. I think like early on, I remember going in and watching a teacher and thinking there's a fundamental problem with the way that you've thought about the purpose of what you're doing in this lesson. But if I go in with that in a coaching conversation, the most likely outcome is that that's just going to be a complete shutdown. Well, I disagree. That's how I teach, and that's it. End of coaching relationship. So, and I've been kind of on both sides of this decision making. I've done that, and it's gone horribly wrong, and that's it. And the coaching's basically fallen apart, and that was a horrible experience to kind of get burned by, and have learned from that actually you need to be able to go, well, okay, that thing's really important, but I'm going to stick that in my back pocket. I'm not even going to touch it. Here's something really tangible and concrete that they're going to agree with, that is close enough to both of our mental models that gives us something solid to work on. And that's going to then build up that trust so that ultimately we'll get to there. But I'm going to take my time and make sure we get there at the right moment, even if I think along the way that's still really important. If I don't bring them with me, then it's not going to happen.
I think like I can't remember again. I'm being really rubbish with like remembering my my sources here, but somebody at one stage did definitely say that trust is the most important action step.
Like,
so it might even have been you, Paul. Was that you?
yeah, and
yes,
there we are.
It literally came out of a conversation having had that experience with my partner coach at school. So I have someone who works in school as their main job is a coach. And I'd come out of a meeting and gone, oh, I'm not sure about this, and I'm a bit worried about this, and I've seen this in a lesson, and I really want to go with this, but I'm just worried about what's going to happen. And so I should credit her, really. So Lindsay Ward, if you're listening, thank you. And she just went, well, I think between us, we kind of come, she went, the highest leverage action step is trust. And I went, that's brilliant. I'm going to write that down. That's going in a blog. But it's kind of stayed with me all the way through that's so important. And if you don't have that, if you're not confident that they're going with you, then I think the rest of it becomes not pointless. That's not the right word. But you know what I mean? Like you've got to get that first.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the rest of it becomes much harder work for sure. Like it's an uphill battle from there, without any shadow of a doubt. And I think,
can I ask?
Go on, Chris. Go.
Can I ask a slightly contentious question? Because thinking about this and putting it all together, and we're talking about peer relationships and contention. If coaching, when it's successful, has trust as its highest leverage point, we're taking that perhaps axiomatically, and we're saying, okay, that's a truth we're gonna live by. How trustworthy are coaches necessarily if we are planning that far ahead? It's slightly, it's a little bit manipulative. It's a little bit, in the best possible way, talking from like an educational leadership point of view, sometimes you've got to have manipulation in what you're doing and thinking in order to achieve your end goal. So the buy-in you're getting feels slightly Wolf and Little Red Riding Hood. I'm going to get you there. I'm going to get you on side. And then I'm going to change the thing about you that I think is wrong, which is quite, Adam and I were discussing last night at some ungodly hour about that being a narrowing of the development of the teacher, as opposed to it being a genuinely open conversation where you are legitimately trying to find each other's surfacing of the mental models. And is that potentially why a teacher of 20 years is automatically going, I'm not engaging in this process because I'm very happy with how I teach, thank you, and I don't want to be told how to do it differently. And we're coming along going, no. We're just two guys. We're just going to have a beer. We're going to chat about how to do things that I think you are doing wrong, and I'm going to get you on side. I'm being slightly verbose. I'm being slightly devil's advocate about it. Yeah. But that is one of the ways that I hear that people think about coaching, and it's been slightly borne out in that conversation about let's reel them in, nice and slowly. Let's get them on the things that we can do together, and then I'm going to change the thing that I think is wrong about them.
I think that's a really good challenge. And so I think, how do I think about that? I suppose the depiction of, like, and I know you're like overplaying it deliberately there, the kind of reeling them in, aha, I've got you, now we'll work on this thing. Like, the reality is, it's more, I suppose, rather than that thing's wrong and I want to fix it, it's that thing's something I want us to talk about. That's something I think that we need to have a conversation about at some point. And when we get to that point, it's not necessarily about me saying, right, well, I'm right and you're wrong, and now you're with me. You can see why you're wrong, can't you? It's about saying, right, at that point, when we've got that level of trust, we're able to then have an open and honest conversation about that stuff. And it might be that actually that teacher of 20 years can turn around and go, well, no, this works. And I've got really good evidence that it works. And here's why it works. And here's my rationale. And here's my evidence. And at which point I'd be happy to go, okay, if I think that there's evidence that matches up with theirs, that's okay. Because, the classic, like, everything works somewhere. Some teachers can make stuff work in their context that other teachers will never get to work. So if somebody's, got the kids acting out, the actions of neurotransmission using the, medium of mime, and they've got that working in their classroom, and I think, God, that looks awful to me. But if it's working and the kids are learning it, I'm not in a position to go, you shouldn't be doing that. So I think you're right.
So
there's a concern
are
there.
Are we potentially therefore saying that?
Right, I'm going to mediate this because you both keep talking over each other. Paul, you go. You're our guest.
No, I think I'd. So I guess it's a softening of what you're saying. But yes, I acknowledge. I think there has to be some long-term thinking there, because you have to be going in and thinking, what do I think? What do I think? Again, what's my hunch is going to have a bigger impact on the learning of the students in this classroom. So I don't think that's underhand to have it, but it just might be about saying, look, if I share that right now, I just think it's not going to have the impact or the effect that I want it to. So I'm going to hold on to that thought, but I'm going to hold it lightly. I'm not going to be. It's not an incontrovertible truth that I'm absolutely certain of, and I may revisit it and change my mind. But there's no point in trying to talk about it yet. I get where you're coming from, and I think it's a really interesting challenge to think about. That I'll need to think on some more. But
but I actually think what you're potentially saying there, from my point of view, is that actually one of the highest leverage points is actually the mindset of the coach, because if the coach is open-minded to dramatic change and they're changing their own position fundamentally, then that's the answer. So potentially it's not about the quality of the coaching session, it's about the quality of the mindset of the coach, and as to whether they're able to walk into a room and go, here is a teacher of X amount of years of experience, or of no experience, but these people could be equally worth the moment where my mind totally changes and goes, I've been on this route for so many years, and actually what you've just convinced me of is going to improve my own practice. So maybe the onus is less on the trust that we're waiting for to appear in the relationship. It's actually the choice of the coach and the training of the coach themselves to be open, to be receptive to having their mind change, and that possibly takes out the evil, dastardly kind of twirly moustache figure of the
I think so. I think I wrote somewhere in a blog about the idea of, like, a good coaching conversation is about trying to bring greater alignment between mental models, so between the teacher's model of what's going on and what teaching looks like, and the coach's model. And that doesn't have to mean like they're coming closer to me, that the coach is pulling the teacher towards them and saying, come move to my mental model because it's better. It's about pulling the two of them together and finding common ground between them and bridging them. Being open to saying, actually, my model needs to be expanded because I hadn't thought about that, is really, really important.
Brilliant.
I think there's there's quite a few things in there. So like the first one is that I think to add to it is that we do have to go into this with like an understanding that what do we know about classroom teaching? It's incredibly complex. There's loads and loads as an environment. There's loads and loads and loads of stuff coming at you all of the time. And so naturally as a teacher, you have to filter certain things out and focus on the bits that are most prevalent to what you're trying to achieve at that time. Because you're having to filter things out, you are naturally going to miss things. So an observer, and I know that word observation has like negative connotations, but I'm going to use it because I can't think of a better word. The observer doesn't have to deal with the complex environment in the same way because they're not delivering the teaching. So therefore, I would suggest that the observer's awareness is probably going to be wider, not their contextual awareness because they don't know the class, they don't know what's been taught previously, and the teaching sequence and all the rest of that stuff. But their awareness of that moment is probably going to be wider. And so if coach and teacher both accept that is a natural phenomenon of teaching, is that you're going to have to narrow your focus, then therefore the views of the coach become interesting and useful to the teacher from the outset. And I think that's a really important distinction to make. It's not about going in and saying, aha, I saw something you didn't because I'm better than you. It's a case of going, of course I saw stuff that you didn't because you're dealing with this incredibly complex environment that I'm not having to as the observer. So I think that's like the first thing that's sort of relevant to this idea of like, how do you how do you get to a point where like the teacher is willing to accept and understand that like you've got a perspective that is worth hearing about. Then I think you're absolutely right. You've touched on it really well and gone into loads of detail about the fact that coaches have to also be willing to be wrong and be open-minded. And also, I think when coaches model that, and it's soft stuff. It's going, my sense was this, but I might be wrong. This is what I thought, but I'm keen to hear your ideas on that. This is my starting point, but let's see how you would move that thought forward. Then if you're like that as the coach, then the teacher is way more likely to adopt that mindset as well. But also I think it's impossible to get away from this idea that like when you're going and watching someone teach, you are naturally as a human being going to go, oh, I wouldn't have done it like that. Or I'd have probably done that slightly differently. Like that's a natural thing you're going to do. And so it's just a case of, you can't stop that, I don't think, but it's a case of, right, how do you treat that thought when it creeps in? And it's about being deliberately there to watch and to listen, to understand what's going on rather than to form a judgment. But that's a conscious mind shift that I think you've got to make as a coach.
Yeah, and I think so to pick up on that, like the process of going in and watching somebody's lesson. I again going back to kind of previous ways that things were done like this, have had all kinds of training in how to observe lessons and all various rubrics and checklists and Ofsted standards and all that sort of stuff. And some schools will have their own little checklist of, have they done X, Y, Z and whatever. When I go in, obviously, if I've got a relationship with the teacher already and we've already agreed a goal, then I know that that's what I'm looking for. But I tend to try and write down kind of a narrative of what's going on. Like, just these are my observations, this is what I'm seeing. And that as I'm doing so, I will try and write questions, or at least think of them. And I think it's that questioning mindset of going, oh, I wonder why you did that, or what's going on here. And even like simple stuff, like if I'm not sure about whether they've secured attention of the room, and I might just write down, how many are listening, or how many are doing what you've asked, or things like that. Because I'm trying to prompt that conversation I'll have later on, that I'm not going to go in and go, oh, you did that and no one was listening. I'm going to say, right, you said this. I wondered if. I noticed that. Can you tell me about this? Or I was curious about. So I think having that questioning mindset as you're actually doing the observation itself, I think is really helpful, because it lends itself to that open conversation of like, I'm curious about this. You tell me what happened here. Let's see what what evidence you got to support that thought. What did I notice? How do those two things marry up or not? So that, you're ready to have a discussion about it rather than impose a judgment. And then, like you say, it's natural to think, well, I might have done this. So I suppose it's also trying to force yourself to go, okay, but if I didn't do that, what else might I have done? And if I did it their way, could I have done it differently? So I've kept the thing so that then when you get to that point of like, okay, well, if we've agreed that there was a thing that could be improved there, we've got options, and we're not just going, well, you did it that way and I think you should have done it that way, because that could cause a big problem in terms of the trust between you. But actually saying, well, I might have tried it like this. What do you think about that solution? Alternatively, we might have, what if we tried it this way? Or have you got a different way of solving that problem? Or how might you refine what you're already doing? So again, it becomes a discussion about options rather than like me saying, I didn't like that, you should do this instead.
And like, I think what really sings through that is like the differences between an observation in a coaching relationship and like many people's experience of formal observation. Like the biggest things that have come out there is like, I think that your purpose for being in there, in that observation, is to watch. And I know I said this before, but it's to watch and to listen to understand, rather than to watch and to listen to judge or to evaluate. And I think that that's the sort of overall mindset shift. And that really comes through all of the sort of actions that you were just talking about taking when you're in that room as the observer.
Yeah, definitely. And I think that's like interesting what you were talking about, Chris, about how your school culture has evolved on this with your kind of come and see thing. Like for us, that's been one of the biggest barriers to get over. So for those like who don't do our kind of full coaching program, they have these like unannounced drop-ins on a reasonably regular basis, where we just pop in and see what's happening, and we try and give some feedback. And we try and frame it in a very similar way to we would in a coaching conversation. So we'll just write things like, I noticed this, I wondered this, I'm curious about this, etc. But it's taken quite a long time for the majority of people to really get on board with the idea that we are just there to try and observe and try and help, and that we're not there with like solutions and we're not judging. And some people have taken that sort of quicker than others. But it's been a long time building up that trust, that so that when we walk in, people don't go, oh, right, game face on. What's the thing we did in CPD? Quick, everyone get the whiteboards out, or whatever it was. That it's actually just, you just carry on, and I'm just here to see what's going on and to see if I can offer any insights. But I'm not judging. And I think that's, again, like laying the groundwork for that and getting those conditions right. It is super important if you want coaching to be able to work, because you need everyone in that on board with that view that we're all just trying to help, but we're all working together on it.
Yeah, because I suppose as well that it's that's linking to habit forming in my mind. That's where my mind immediately goes to, because that time you're given to developing the language, developing the culture, is also allowing the time to develop the habits. As a performer, as my kind of principal thing that I've always done, is the biggest lesson you learn is that you can learn all of the technique. Say you're about to sing a song, you can learn all of the technique and the notes and the words and what you should do. But every single time, the moment you get on stage, it will all go, and you rely solely on habits. And you can have practice and practice and practice, but if it hasn't become habit forming, it will disappear. And if you don't do it now, it won't ever happen. So we used to run a drama school, and the rehearsals were really, really good. And then you get them on stage and they'd forget it all to a certain level. A certain percentage would be forgotten. And if they did that 4 or 5 times, you knew in your head that they're always going to do that. So we can either focus on the fact that they're always going to do this, or we can build in some more time. In a performance type environment, that time is very limited. But I guess in a school and a teaching environment, you can begin to stretch that out so that actually they don't jump to game face, they don't jump to cold calling or mini whiteboards because they think it's what they should do because you're in the room. The thing they fall back to is their best version of their teaching. Does that make sense? So it's like their automatic reaction. It's kind of the best teachers sometimes that I've come across is that their 50% is other people's 100%, because they're always pushing forward. And they can actually, do you know what, step down a bit, take a breather, relax, calm down. It's not a problem. And they're very often the teachers that are working the hardest, because they don't believe that their 100% is everybody else is 100%.
Yeah.
I think there's a really big piece there around, and we wrote about this recently on one of our EduPulse blogs, because often it's about raising the floor rather than raising the ceiling. So you make sure that like the sort of automated worst version, if you like, of whatever a teacher is doing in a classroom is still really good. And I think that's sort of the point you're getting at there, Chris, which is great. I think this is quite a nice segue into like the next bit that we wanted to talk about, which was mental models. And like your blog on mental models, like, I mean, I think you must have written that about a year and a bit ago now.
Yeah, something like that. Like it started off from a talk at Research Ed Kent in 2022. That evolved a bit, and then I posted it. Yeah, sometime last year, I think I wrote it. A much better version.
So like and like the thing that when I first read that really jumped out at me is this idea that like you were talking about the coach's mental model and the teacher's mental model potentially to begin with being like sitting separately, and trying to establish alignment between the two. And like that struck me as like the thing that I wrote down. I looked back at my notes the other day from it. The thing that I wrote down was that you were using that as a way. You were sort of using awareness as a way to create alignment.
Yeah,
would that be about right?
Yeah, and I think within that it was important that like I got a bit excited with Venn diagrams, but that you had essentially 4 things going on at once, because you had like the teacher's kind of baseline mental model of what they think teaching looks like or good teaching looks like, and you have the coach's version of that as well. And that, so there's a broader, bigger kind of underneath all of this conversation about how much those 2 things align. But you've also got to then have the much more context specific mental model of what happened in the classroom from both the teacher and the coach's perspective. And so it's like all 4 things of those are in play at once. And I suppose you've got to start off by considering the alignment in your insight and awareness in the what happened in the room bit of the model first, to then kind of extrapolate from that and work into the okay, what does this tell us about like the broader understanding of teaching and our mental model there. So that starts with that thing about awareness of like, well, you know, I saw this, tell me about that. I noticed this happening, tell me about that. And to see, like you say, that a teacher isn't going to observe or notice all of the same things that a coach does in the room. So it's kind of working out where the common ground is there and where there's not alignment, and then how you kind of help pull those things together so that they're starting to appreciate the same things that you're seeing and vice versa. And then once you've got that, then you can start to talk about, okay, well, how does that get drawn from our kind of bigger model of what teaching looks like, and work on that.
Is there a case, do you think, for looking at those sort of underpinning beliefs about what good teaching is? And when I say beliefs, I don't sort of mean ideological beliefs. I mean like theoretical beliefs, I guess. Is there a case for characterizing that as like that's a schema? Because you know it's not necessarily it's not something that's sort of responsive to the moment. You don't typically change your beliefs about what good teaching is because of something that's happening in the moment right now. What you would change in the moment is is kind of the action that you're taking because of a cause that you've seen in that room. So could you look at it as like, okay, so these underpinning beliefs is kind of like your schema of what good teaching is. Your mental model is your interpretation of what is happening in the room at that time, or retrospectively your interpretation of what happened in that room, the choices, the consequences, the concerns that you had as a teacher in that moment that informed the choices that you made, and therefore led to the consequences or the effects of those. Is that a useful way to potentially think about it, do you think?
Yes. I think schemas it's another one of those terms that sort of got a bit of definitional slippage, or it's used in different ways. Like I teach about it from a psychology perspective, and I guess my schema for schemas, my mental model for it, is that those 2 terms have often been used quite interchangeably to mean pretty much the same thing. And on one level, I think that's really helpful. But I think what you're talking about is separating those out slightly. And I think I'm not quite there with being sure about like which one I would want to use to describe which thing, if that makes sense. So I think you might be right, but I'm just not sure yet because I haven't quite figured out how to separate those terms out properly in my head. I think Ollie Caviglione put out something quite useful recently about it. I forget on the basis of whose work, but the difference between them, and that's something I need to kind of go back and read a bit more carefully, if it's going to be useful to
I
kind
think
of move these conversations.
Yeah, I mean, he was essentially saying, I think that, and please God, don't let me be wrong about this, but I think what he was essentially getting at was this idea that like schema is more kind of hierarchical. And if you go back to like Azure Bell's work from like, as far back as the 60s, I think that's what he was getting at, was like, you know, you have these sort of bigger concepts that then feed down into the smaller concepts that come from that. Whereas mental models are more cause and effect, so they kind of go this way. I'm pointing to the side for anybody that's listening. Whereas schemas sort of go this way. I'm now pointing down.
Okay.
I think that was the sort of crux of what he was getting at. But I'm sure he would say that in a far more eloquent and frankly poetic way than me.
I'm going to write that down.
I always think, and you can tell me completely that I'm wrong, but this is what this podcast is about. It's about open thinking and thinking on my feet. The way I've always thought about it, and continue to think about it until this moment where I publicly shame myself, is that mental models feel as though they have more locomotion, more movement about them. They have a direction that they're traveling in. That whereas schemas, they grow, but it feels like they grow more internally. That it's something you build in and of itself. Whereas a mental model feels like there's like Adam was saying, there's a causality. There's if then moments. It's moving and spreading. Whereas to me, a schema feels more like a hat box that I'm putting things inside, and it's building
static.
a whole thing that I can hold on to, and that's my hat box. But a mental model feels more like a web that's shooting away from me. I've just mixed a load of images and metaphors in the way my brain is thinking about it right now.
So we're sort of suggesting.
Could you
go on?
No, go on, Paul. You go.
Like, if I've understood that description, I think that makes sense. That we're sort of suggesting that schemas are perhaps more static, whereas mental models are more dynamic, and that mental models are served by those schemas. So the mental model is like drawing on the different schemas that you've got to make those causal predictions.
That's what I was thinking, except I used hat boxes and spiders' webs together, and that's why you do what you do, Paul. I'm the metaphor guy, and I mix them up terribly, and then you go, oh yeah, well, dynamic and static, and I'm like, well, oh, there we are. That's why we do this. That's why we broaden the conversation so that my mental craziness can be pinned down into something that's can be actually intellectually debated.
I'm going to try a metaphor, which I don't do often. Like Chris and I are writing a book together at the moment, and when I read what Chris has written in the chapters that he's written, it always makes me feel like entirely inadequate, because like he has this amazing way of like comparing like an Ofsted inspection to like the Battle of the Iceni, and it like really works every time. Whereas then you read mine and it's like, here are 7 bullet points about this thing. But I'm going to try a metaphor. So could you think about it then as like schema is almost like the blueprints of a house, which does have an element of dynamism to it, because it does shift and it does build. You can have an extension. So perhaps like schema could be like the blueprints of a house, whereas mental models is more like a GPS in a car that sort of has different traffic responsive variations to it. So actually, we're going to take you this direction now because there's this problem on this particular route. What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I suppose if I was trying to think of a way that, so instead of talking about blueprint, then I guess using like, an A to Z, if anyone even knows what those are anymore, roadmap is more analogous, because that's the static version, whereas the GPS is the dynamic version. To a degree, I guess the thing
nice.
that sits in my mind there is also that like one of the functions of schemas, as I've understood it and I've taught it, because it's part of the edible psychology thing, is that it actually allows us to make predictions about the world. which to me feels like that's crossing over into
Yeah.
what we're saying a mental model is for. And that's what, you come back to like schema theory and Piaget and Bartlett and people who talked about it, that like that was part of that original conception. So I think there's some crossover there, that because schemas allow us to kind of quickly like assess situations and figure out likely outcomes of things. So I'm not sure that the distinction, again, I may be wrong. I'm not sure if the distinction is quite as clear cut as that, but I'm happy to be completely wrong.
No,
I suppose
I agree. I think there's a symbiotic relationship that's going on between them. I don't think you can have mental models without schema.
no.
And what one completely feeds the other, and it's about trying to find out where the crossover is, how big that cross section of the Venn diagram is, or that it may be completely impossible to separate the two, and that there is a part of the world of schema that is just schema, has got nothing to do with mental models, and a world of mental models has got nothing to do with schema. And I think what's exciting about the thinking that everybody's doing at the moment, is that is happening, and people are receptive to everybody's thoughts, but that we may, as with all science, rest on the fact that the non-answer is more of the answer. Like, it's not possible to separate these two things, and we may be barking up a tree that is not necessary. But it's just fascinating to be able to just sit in this forum and have that conversation and listen. If you are listening and you want to get in touch with any of us, Paul is on X. Have you jumped onto Blue Sky yet, Paul?
No, not yet, because I'm the last of the late adopters, so I'm just terrible at like jumping onto new stuff and hate the idea of having more than one social media platform. So I will get there eventually.
We're on it, but we're terrible. We're on it, but we're terrible at doing both. So Paul is over on X, Paul Cline _Psy, PSY, and you've got us, EduPulse Co. And listen, if you have any of these thoughts, or you want to get involved with the conversation, or you like, or Ollie Cav, you're listening, and you want to come on, let's do this all again, but we can have a chat about it, because, as Adam said at the beginning, we're all about broadening that conversation and having people in and discussing things that other people think are just a given, and they aren't givens. And I think that's what's exciting about this conversation.
I think the other thing, probably just to come back to that better analogy that you just gave for around like the A to Z, I suppose the thing, A to Z can also change when new things are built and added in as well. So there would still be that sort of element of dynamism to those as well. So I think that's a great one. It does also sound a little bit like, and I know Chris just said the word there, but I think there's another Venn diagram for you to write a blog using, potentially, on the whole crossover between schemas and mental models. Because we know you like a Venn diagram.
I do, yeah. I think
all right, so go on.
Well, I was just going to bring this back to a conversation we were having actually right just before we kind of started recording it, and the stuff that you put out recently, and some of the stuff that like Sarah Cottinghat's been working on, which is really interesting, really exciting around this whole kind of mental models and stuff like that. And Adam Robbins put out a post on X, which I thought was really important for making me and I hope others like just stop and think for a second. And he kind of said, like, this is all great, but are we at risk of getting a level of abstraction too far to stop being helpful? Mm-hmm. And I think that's, if you come back to like what's our working definition of instructional coaching and all that sort of stuff, like ultimately it's about helping teachers to make sure that the learning improves. And so I think we've got to always have an eye on this, that like we don't end up getting too like down an intellectual rabbit hole of like schemas and mental models and stuff like that, that it stops being useful to the coach or to the teacher in having those actual conversations. And like, that's not to say I don't think that the discussion is absolutely worthwhile and important, but there's also a degree to which we have to think about how that translates into what we actually do on the ground when we're having those conversations. And that level of abstraction may not be remotely appropriate for a certain conversation. And so knowing how to filter that through in ways that is actually useful, I think is a really, really important part of it, and maybe like something that coach training needs to like really think about. And that's all built into that idea of like being responsive and knowing where you can go in a conversation with your coachee and where it wouldn't work with that particular person. So I think that's just kind of a useful check on this level of thinking that it's always got to come back to how does this end up being useful to everybody. And yeah, I'm grateful for Adam to putting that out, because I think a similar kind of thing was rumbling in the back of my mind, but I hadn't articulated it. And he put his finger on a concern that I think is worth thinking about.
Yeah, we completely agree. It's about having your foot in the abstract and having your foot in the real world, the concrete, and saying how is what we're thinking about now going to affect our daily practice, and actually how much of it is going to require a preamble, because if we don't get this right and it becomes too much in the abstraction, you're going to end up spending a lot of your coaching sessions training your coachee on what schemas and mental models are so they can understand where you're coming from, and that's not the point.
Yeah,
you want it so that it's accessible, and I guess sometimes you've got to dig all the way down to Neverland and Wonderland in order to go and then come all the way back up and go, actually, we've thought about this in great detail, and now we've come up with a simple thing that encompasses all of these abstract ideas.
Yeah.
But you're right, we have to keep a check on each other, because as friends sometimes and as academic colleagues or even just kind of chatting down the pub or whatever, you can indulge each other and head down that rabbit hole and never come back. And then what started out as something that was well-meaning just adds another barrier between the public and education, which really doesn't need to be there.
Yeah.
Because everyone's trying to do a good thing, and they're trying to improve things for people. So yeah, it's always a good thing. And Adam Robbins have been in touch recently with a couple of responses to Adam's rehearsal and coaching blog that we put out yesterday. Yeah, it's so important. Come back and say, hang on a second, what about this? And a bit like coaching, I guess, if I'm open to change my mind from something, a piece of evidence that's been put in front of me, or thought that's been put in front of me, or I've got a position that's robust enough to go, yeah, but what about this? Then that's the healthy way of doing it. But you're exactly right, Paul. There's a chance that people just listen to this and go, well, I've got to go and teach geography. I'm off. Oh, sorry, this is far too. I'm trying to think of the word, but for listeners, my fingers are floating in the air. It's a bit too
nebulous.
Nebulous. That was the word. Thank you so much. You see, it was my fingers were doing the brain thing. Sorry, listeners, but Paul got one because he can see me, so he knew what I was doing. It's a bit too nebulous.
Right. Cue some dramatic music, because...
Oh, wait, hang on. I'm going to try something. Ready? I haven't got dramatic music, but I have got... Go.
I don't. Oh, there you go. Paul just coughed over me because he knew what I was about to say. Unbelievable.
No, it's still on a coughing bit in me,
yeah. I don't think I fully agree.
Oh,
yeah. Go on, put your boxing gloves on.
I don't have an ooh.
I mean, look, fundamentally, there's a lot there that you said that's like utterly sensible. Like, I think the big thing that I took from it is like we've got to think about who the coaching session is for fundamentally. So it's for the teacher, and I think there can be a risk sometimes, especially where instructional coaching and cognitive science to an extent, and things like mental models, because they can become popular and, like, dare I say it, even cool. I think that there could be a risk that like coaches could go into a coaching session and like subconsciously see that as like an opportunity for intellectual indulgence. And I think it's important to remember, like, the coaching session is for the teacher. So the communication element in that coaching session, you've got to kind of meet the teacher there. I think, though, that one of the biggest challenges that you've got with coaching is trying to make the abstract, i.e. like learning and the likelihood of learning having taken place, trying to make that abstract like a bit more concrete, and trying to find ways of representing that is I think useful. At worst, I think that is definitely useful. So if you think about, like, and this is just how I've used a mental model recently, right? So I taught a lesson for an ECT that I've been coaching, and I asked her to, like, using a template that I gave her, I asked her to sketch out a mental model of what she thought I was doing. So, like, what could you see me actually doing? What do you think the reason I chose to do that thing was? So, what was the cause of my action? What did you see me do as a result then of the action that I took, and what do you think caused that? So, like, fairly straightforward. It's basically like 2 layers of cause and effect, and then overall, like, what do you think was the thing that I was trying to achieve, like, as an overall concern, I guess, in that in that exchange. I then taught that lesson. I then came away from it and immediately sketched out my mental model of what I was doing in this particular moment of that lesson. And I was very deliberate about what I was trying to do. So I accept that, I was very conscious of it while I was delivering it, because I knew what I wanted to use this for. And then what we did was we sat down afterwards and we compared. We went, right, okay, you saw this, I saw this, or this is my mental model, this is yours. Let's put these together. Where do you see the similarities? Where do you see the differences? And we started with the similarities because then it just sort of gave quite a nice sort of positive flavour to the conversation. But then we really zoomed in on the differences. And it's like, okay, so you saw me do this and you thought I did that for this reason, but actually I intended to do it for this reason. I think that this reason was more powerful than this one. I think maybe it's a concern more than a reason, and Sarah Cottinghat would definitely be able to tell us if it's a concern or a reason. But let's say it's a concern for now. I think this concern is more powerful than this one, and so that's actually what informed my action. I think that getting that ECT to think about the actions that are being taken in a classroom as being in response to cues in the classroom, but also in response to, like, my overall purpose or concern, I think there's innate value in that. What do you reckon?
Yes, broadly.
See you next time, guys. Thank you for listening.
Yeah. So I guess, because what you're doing there, like, so we've just, me and Chris have just said we both worried that there's a danger of this becoming overly abstract. But the actions you've taken there is to find a way to deliberately make that abstract feel more concrete by having them sketch it out, being very, and also having a really specific hyper focus of, like, this thing. And because in that context, you were able to, like, say, deliberately do certain things because you wanted to surface particular ideas. So that was a great vehicle for making that mental model and the language around it more concrete. So I suppose the challenge is, how do you do that effectively in a normal coaching conversation, as in where you've gone in and seen somebody teaching a bit and then you want to have the debrief on it, is to find a way that works, that the coach and the coachee feel comfortable with, so that it feels like a productive use of the time. So I think it sounds great. And in that context, brilliant. So I guess the challenge is, how do you make that work in other contexts all of the time? And I suppose an ECT is somebody who hopefully is much more open to that sort of learning, because that's where they are in their career. And they're much more used to this idea of, well, let's talk about this and let's do this. They kind of come in, part of their mental model is, that already exists, is this is the point of what I'm doing here. I'm learning about stuff. Compare that to your teacher of 10, 15, 20 years. I think they're at a slightly different place, perhaps. Not always, but sometimes. So getting to that point where they're comfortable doing that and see the value in it might take a bit more groundwork, perhaps, to be able to do that level of kind of abstraction to concrete that you were able to do perhaps more easily there. But again, I don't know the context or the person, so it's hard to say that. So broadly, yes, I agree with you.
Cool. So, all right. So, how about this way of using it as well? Then, so I did another coaching session recently where, so I'd gone and I'd watched the lesson and I'd formulated all of my thinking, and then in the coaching session itself, when I was going through the questions that I was asking the coachee, I was also kind of mapping out what I was taking from them as being their mental model. So my questions were very much around, okay, tell me about what happened at this particular part of the lesson. Tell me what you think. Tell me what you noticed at this point. What was it that cued that action? And so as they were explaining it, I was mapping out their mental model as I sort of saw it. And I then at the point of when they'd finished, I then showed them that. I'm like, okay, so do you think this represents your thinking accurately, or is there anything in here that I've misunderstood? Is there anything that you would add into that? Is there any context that's missing from this? Do we need to add anything in to kind of capture like the fullness of your thinking and decision making? And I think what that did, and he did actually add in a small thing as well, a small piece. But I think what that did was it gave us again something that would have otherwise been quite abstract. It put it in one place for us to then really reflect on it and isolate the elements of it that we wanted to really focus in on the next parts of the conversation. So we're like, okay, let's look at this concern here, this thing that you were concerned about at the start. Was that the thing to be concerned about, or was there something else? Or let's look at this. So, you've got this, you've taken this action because you've interpreted the environment in this way. Are there other interpretations of that environment? Are there other problems that could have caused that symptom that you observed that then cued your response to that? Like, what are the other things that we might consider? And again, it enabled us to kind of like park the rest of the model. Let's focus on like what informed the action that you took and the interpretation that you had of what was going on. Are there other interpretations that you could have used?
Yeah, so I'm going to need to think about that. So yeah,
that's a good thing.
Yeah, again, like I absolutely, I think there's merit there in exploring that, and I think you're probably further down the line than I am in terms of turning that into something that you can actually use in a coaching conversation, in a concrete way. I'd be really interested actually in seeing. You said you had a template, that you shared with your ECT. That'd be quite nice to have a look at and see if that's a useful tool to bring into those coaching conversations. I suppose another thought that just popped into my head, again reflecting on a recent coaching conversation with someone, is sometimes we'll try and have that discussion and say, okay, so this happened in the lesson, I noticed this, what were you thinking about there? Trying to surface those thoughts that you've described there. And the honest answer from some of the teachers I've worked with is they go, oh, that was last week, I can't really remember. Do you know what I mean? And that's not an uncommon response, because of it'd be lovely if I could sit down with them immediately after the lesson but the realities of working within a timetable and our the way our cycle works is that it might be a week, it might even be 10 days between seeing the lesson and then us having the debrief.
Yeah.
Now of course, video might be one answer to that, and absolutely that's something we're thinking about, but we're not there yet. But even then, sometimes teachers just go, honestly, I don't know. I can't remember. I'm not sure what I was thinking. And then there's a danger that it almost becomes, either they start going, well, it might have been this or it might have been that, but they're kind of just speculative. It's really speculative. Or I suppose there's a danger of us then saying, well, was it this or was it this, that we're almost supplying answers that we think it might be, but maybe that it wasn't there. And there's so I think there's, I don't know what the solution to that is, and I don't think it's a criticism of what you're suggesting. It's simply like another challenge that we have to kind of figure out is how to ensure that what a teacher's able to tell us in a coaching conversation accurately reflects what they were actually thinking at the time. And like you said, Chris, about defaulting to habits, and once you hit the moment of performance, once you're in the lesson, a lot of thought just goes out the window. So I wonder sometimes how much clarity people actually have of what was I thinking about at that particular moment, because they were thinking about a whole bunch of things, not just in that particular bit of the lesson, but also all of the bits that came before it and after it, and then the 58 million other things that they had to think about in the rest of the day. By the time they get to the conversation with you, being able to really clarify, I thought that, so I wondered that, and so I did that. Again, maybe doesn't feel fully like what some teachers are able to articulate in those contexts. Does that ring true with your experience at all? Or
Yeah, like I think that there definitely is that. I definitely also come up against this thing of like, well, I did this, I guess, because that's what I do. I'm not sure what it was that cued me to do X. But I think that when teachers say that, we go, okay, great. Like let's like use what we know about learning generally. So like coming to what StepLab would describe as insights. Like let's tap
Yeah.
into that and see if there's any. Let's test out what you did and see if it stands up to reason when we consider what we know about the learning process. And I guess in that respect, what we're then doing is hopefully trying to integrate what we know about how learning works with that teacher's practice. So even if they don't know, if it's a good thing they've done and it's effective, even if they didn't know why they'd done it, like now they do. And I don't necessarily think that means, oh, now they can do it consciously for that reason, because I don't think that's necessarily helpful. But at least that they will come away from that conversation feeling like, yeah, what I am doing is backed by what the evidence suggests. What I'm doing is likely to be having a good impact. And when we come back to one of the purposes of a coaching conversation and a coaching relationship being about trying to build confidence and autonomy and a sense of professional identity, because I think these things are absolutely massive, both for individuals but also for us as a profession in terms of like trying to get to this retention crisis. If we can do that with that conversation, then I think there's worthwhile gains to be. It's a worthwhile thing to do because of the gains that we'll get from it as well. Should we just have like 2 or 3 minutes on rehearsal? Because I know that's it was a subject of a blog that we put out yesterday, and I know Paul, you've blogged about it before. So yeah, go on, rehearsal.
Okay. Okay. So first up, I think it's another one of those things that it means different things to different people, and that's a problem from the start because for some, it's quite a narrow thing that tends to be much more around behavioural stuff, performative stuff, the stand up and do it. Okay, let's practice how you're going to explain that task to the class. Let's practice how you're going to correct that behaviour or whatever it is. I know what you've talked about, what I've written about as well, is a broader conception of that, which involves much more kind of cognitive rehearsal as well, where we're actually thinking through that, okay, how are you going to act like that? What are you going to do? Which might not require the teacher or the coach to stand up and do it, but just to essentially like play through different scenarios and discuss the reasons behind them and the kind of work, how are you going to do that and when are you going to do that, but without actually the get up and do it. And so my senses, my feeling from being kind of pretty immersed in the kind of coaching literature and everything over the last few years, and a lot of the stuff that people are putting out on social media and what have you, books and blogs and webinars, is that the former has been massively privileged over the latter. That there's a much bigger focus on the behavioural performative stuff. That's the stuff that you see in all the examples. That's the stuff in all the training I had early on was always around those kinds of things. and of course, like those things are really important and really useful, and in those contexts, rehearsal is a really important tool, but it's not everything. And I think it just leaves it potentially leaves like an impoverished picture of like the richness of coaching. And so my concern is not not should or shouldn't we use rehearsal. It's just, are we thinking about like the right kind of rehearsal for the right things? To paraphrase whoever it was who said that originally. The right thing, the right time, right reason, etc. So for me, it's a tool and it's a really important one. But I think it can look like different things. And as long as we're okay with that we don't think that rehearsal means we have to have done 3 rounds of getting them on their feet and practicing doing something, then that's okay. I think there are sometimes instances when perhaps rehearsal might not be necessary. And I have anecdotal evidence of like times when I've just gone, okay, should we work on this? Yep, cool. How's that going to work? Brilliant, great, off you go. And I've walked into that class, the next time, and they've done it. And we didn't do rehearsal. And so it's hard to square that with anyone saying you can't leave rehearsal out, which is what the message appears to be in some quarters. But sometimes you might want to argue, well, okay, you having the conversation, how are you going to do that? What's that going to look like? That counts as rehearsal, in which case, fine. I guess it's just having that flexibility there. to see it as the tool to use in the right way at the right time, but not feeling like if you haven't done some official rehearsal in your coaching session that you haven't done it properly, or that you're not going to have an effect. Equally, you might go, right, I didn't do it then, and I walked into the lesson and they didn't do it, or they didn't do it well. Right, actually, I should have rehearsed that. Totally on board with that too. So again, that's probably about knowing the coachee you're working with, their context, and sort of feeding your way a little bit on that and what works for them. So that feels like it's a bit of an evasive answer, probably, but I think it's really complex.
I think that's great. Complex is definitely the word. I think there's definitely a case for, I think really importantly actually, it's got to be about rehearsing thinking, and perhaps also like rehearsing. It's not necessarily the decision making, but it's almost trying to simulate the choices and the options that you have. So I know I put this in the in the blog that we put out yesterday, but it's like I did this thing where like we had for anyone who hasn't read the blog, you should, because we'd really appreciate it if you did. But thanks very much. But yeah, ultimately we did some group rehearsal linked to a reading lesson, and the comments that teachers were making, having done the rehearsal in pairs, was like they were on the lines of, I noticed that this thing is actually quite important in there. So it was things like, oh yeah, I noticed actually that like the speed that I ask the question at is really important, and actually the length of pause that I leave after the question before then naming the child that I want to answer, like that felt really important. The spacing between questions, like that was like quite key as well. And they were kind of getting all of that feedback from their rehearsal partners. I don't necessarily think that was like rehearsal in a performative sense, but I think it was like rehearsing the thinking that they were doing, and also rehearsing the responses that they felt they should make, or at least identifying the responses that they could make, but by sort of simulating the feelings that they would have been likely to have had they just gone straight into to do that in front of a class of kids.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I think that's really interesting, that idea of, like you say, once you do it, you start to go, oh, I hadn't thought about that bit. And, oh, when I say it out loud, actually, I need to think more about that. I think that's totally important. I would disagree slightly that I still think that is of a performative nature, not in a like pejorative negative way in any way, but that it's still very much that's a thing that a teacher's going to physically do in a lesson, is going to stand there and ask a question. And so it's something that can be rehearsed in that sense of let's practice asking that question. Sometimes there's stuff that it might be about like the way that you've planned like a sequence of activities and how you've gone from here to here to here in a lesson. And that's the thing that we're working on in coaching. It might be more about the content of the question itself. It might be looking at, I don't know, that your design teachers trying to design a specific thing for the students to do to practice an idea or to develop their thinking around an idea. So you're looking at the resource design, or you're looking at the content of that. Now, there might be some instructional element to that as well, of like, okay, so how are you going to tell them, how are you going to set this task up? And that lends itself to that kind of rehearsal. But some of that thinking doesn't, I don't think. And so again, it's not that I'm saying it's not rehearsal, but I think it looks different, and it would be much more the discussion of, okay, so what's going to work if we do it in this way around, or if we ask the question in using these words or whatever. Doesn't require them to sort of like do it in the same way, but I still think it has that element of mental simulation in there. Does that make sense?
Yeah, like mental simulation. Yeah, mental simulation. I think like simulation was probably what I was trying to get at when I was sort of stumbling over my words earlier around simulating, being in that environment where something like you think you've got the routine absolutely nailed, and like yes, you know what it is you're going to do within that routine, but like being able to simulate the nuance of that routine and like all of those little tiny bits. You're like, okay, the routine on paper is this, and like that is what I've done. But actually, like the experience of each of those parts that I have has like flagged what some really important components of each of those stages. So, like for example, in the example I gave earlier, so the routine that we were working on was asking check for listening questions when a teacher is reading aloud. just to make sure that students are following along. And like, so the routine would be, ask, check for listening question at this point, this point, this point. But actually, it's only then by practicing that teachers are able to go, actually, like the spacing bit of this is really important. Like, I can't, if I leave it too long, then potentially I've lost them and they're not going to have the flow. But if the questions are too close together, they're not going to get a flow of the story. So actually, and the only reason they knew that was because their rehearsal partner was going, right, my experience of that as you were reading was that I couldn't really follow the story because the questions were too close together. So, but again, they'd only get that from having that feedback, and they'd only get the feedback from sort of having the simulation of that event.
Yes. Again. So again, it's good. I just keep going yes, and then we're fine. So I suppose, another element of that, which again I mentioned to you kind of on Twitter last night. Sorry, X. Is balancing the load of that. So, and again, it just keeps coming back to the like knowing who you're working with and where they are with kind of their mental model, etc. That if you've said like, okay, let's work on this core routine that's really, really critical for engaging attention or whatever it is. That's the main thing. Those rounds of rehearsal, which might bring to the surface loads of those nuances, like super important that we start to think about them. But we've got to work out like at what point is that teacher going to hit overload, and that there is too many bits and bobs. There's too much nuance to think about. That actually you need to shelve that and go like that's important, but let's come to it. Let's get the core sorted first, and just play around with like that, like within a very narrow set of parameters, and know that okay, now let's go and see how that plays out in a lesson, and then we can come back to it and go right now we've got that core there. Now let's start to build in the extra if-thens and the what have you, and the situational variance. Push the edges of that so that they can really refine it. But so I think it's about knowing when and where that's appropriate to do it. And when it's, because I guess what you don't want to end up with doing is leaving a position where a teacher is kind of leaving that thing going, oh my God, there are so many things I have to think about getting this right, that when they get to actually doing it in the classroom, they end up either paralyzed by it or just stumbling over it because they're going, oh, hang on, crap, what was I meant to do at that bit? Oh, and sure, was I meant to do it that way, on that too? It's kids doing that now, what do I do? And then they've lost the ability to actually do the thing because they're just overthinking it. So we need to get them to a point where they can do the thing well, like you said, the what's the flaw that we might want to get them to first, like the well enough that it's working for most pupils in the most common scenario, and then start to build in around the edges. And again, so that's about knowing who you're working with and at what level that you think they're going to be able to deal with that, and testing that out a little bit, but almost going, okay, like, just forget that bit. Let's just rein it in. Let's just come back to the main thing first, before you worry about all the extra nuance and complexity. Does that make sense?
So like, yeah, it totally does. I think like there's a few things that there are in that. I think that the issue of load and like managing the cognitive load of the teacher is absolutely a salient point. I think that there's a couple of things. So firstly, I think you can reduce some of that load by planning the steps. So for example, there were sort of three things I think that really came out of the conversations that teachers were having during rehearsal. The first one was, it really seems to matter how fast I ask the question. It really seems to matter like the space I leave between asking the question and naming the student. And it really seems to matter the amount of space that exists between questions. So like, yeah, I agree. I wouldn't want the teacher like thinking of those, trying to hold those three things in their head, in their working memory consciously while they're teaching the lesson. So what we sort of did is, okay, this third one, the thing around like it really matters how far apart the questions are spaced. Well, if we get a copy of the text and we annotate that text with which questions are we going to ask and where are we going to ask them, we now don't have to be conscious of that. We've outsourced that to essentially what is our lesson material, which for us actually is also the lesson plan as well. We don't have any slides to that. It's literally just like that's the plan. So we've kind of outsourced that first one. The second one would be around, okay, so it's this thing around, it's really important how fast I read the question, or how, reading the question at a pace that is right for the student. And also this thing about like leaving a pause between the question and naming the student. Okay, well, we don't really even want to be conscious of both of those things. Like, let's think about like which one we want to really be working on and naming and nailing first. We went, okay, let's to start with, let's really focus on reading the question at the right pace, right? Because if we read the question really fast and the kids can't take it in, and then we leave, but we've left this lovely gap between asking the question and naming the student, then the student still might not be able to answer, and so it's gonna end up making us think, oh, something's gone wrong here, and maybe we might interpret that as the wrong thing going wrong. So let's focus on this bit first, and then once you kind of feel like you've nailed that, then we know at least you can come back to this thing about leaving a longer gap between asking the question and naming the student. So it almost works like a little bit of a medium-term plan, where you're going, right, this thing here, we can outsource that to planning. Then that leaves us with these two issues. We're going to work on this issue first because of this reason. But we know, coach and teacher together, that further down the line we'll come back to this issue. So we know where we're heading to, and that sort of situates why we're working on this first thing first.
Yeah, and I suppose it's knowing about how big a gap you can or need to leave between getting the thing that you've identified as being like the priority and then adding on the other stuff. And that might be within the space of a single like coaching session where you've got 20 minutes to spend on rehearsal, and you can go, right, let's nail that thing now, and now we can build on this because we've got enough time to iterate that and to really like hone it. But again, coming up again, like the rubber hits the road, the realities of like busy teachers in schools, you might think, actually, in this coaching session, that's too ambitious. We're not going to get there. But yeah, you're right. We might signal it and go like, let's come back and talk about this in our next meeting. But right now, let's just focus on getting that bit and acknowledging together that that's not going to be perfect in the classroom, probably, because there's these bits of nuance that we're not going to get to now, but we're going to get to them further down the line. So I suppose, yeah, it's then knowing, like I said, when and where you've got the space to do that, and when you've not got a structure where you've got like everybody getting together to do those kind of rehearsal sessions like you're describing, that might be harder to get that time for that. I think that's only what we found a massive challenge is, teachers already were asking them to essentially give up time to have their coaching conversations with us. So we've got to make them feel as efficient as possible, which means maybe, stripping it back a little bit. But because it's a long-term thing, that if we do, again, the whole sort of, I guess, fundamental principle of instructional coaching is little bits at a time. So if you're going to be working with someone for several months, then it's okay that you don't fix like that much of the problem in one go. Sorry, now for the benefit of listeners, holding out my hands this far apart, and you can narrow it down and go, I'm only doing that little bit, and then we'll come back and broaden it out next time, because you're going to be meeting them again next week or 2 weeks time or whatever it is. So it's about fitting that to your context.
Love it.
Yeah, it's hugely about culture for me. Always coming back to context, as you were saying, Paul. Twitter is I don't acknowledge its new name. Twitter is a confusing space for this conversation because there's a lot of American voices in there, and the fact is, over in the States, the coaching culture is so vastly different that there are people hired as full-time coaches. That's their job. It's their job to go around and sit and have these sessions and go and meet the teachers, and we just don't have that here necessarily. It may be happening in some quarters, but we don't. So the conversations about rehearsal and schemas and mental models and coaches and mentoring and instructional, all this kind of stuff gets so muddied online with all these conversations because some people are coming at it from such different angles. Like, this is a British coaching conversation, an American coaching conversation. I found from a person not really engaged in either is like, you two are talking about very, very different things, and as in America and the UK. And then what we're trying to do here is trying to get some of that magic that they've clearly got, that the ability to have a person who thinks entirely about coaching, entirely about the development of the teachers through an angle of coaching. I guess the closest thing we've got, Paul, is you in terms of having a teacher who's in charge of teaching and learning. But you're, one of the tools you use is in instructional coaching.
Yeah, and I suppose again back to what I said earlier, I feel quite privileged that my school was invested in that, in the sense, and I have a reduced timetable to give me the time and the space to be able to do the thinking around it and the planning and the and I can fit around other people's timetables. But that's always going to come up against the fact that I'm working with teachers who don't have as much time, and so squeezing it in and getting the most from that, but without taking away too much of their time is kind of a thing constantly on my mind. Actually, just as a little example, this was brought home to me quite strongly a couple of weeks ago, where I had an arranged coaching meeting with a teacher I'm working with, and for both slightly different but similar pastoral reasons with different students, we both ended up 20 minutes late to the same meeting. And it was like, okay, we've got a choice here. We can either go, right, let's scratch this and come back to it when we've got more time, or let's try and, in the sort of 10, 15 minutes we have available, get something out of this. And it was the latter that we went with, but it meant that we had to kind of really strip back a lot of the stuff that I might want to do in a coaching conversation to the absolute core, so that there was still something useful. Because I think in my mind, the trade-off of leaving it that long before we then had a catch up on the lesson and worked on something new felt like we were going to lose momentum. So being able to kind of go, okay, I'd love to do all of that stuff, but what's the absolutely most useful, important stuff I can do to get something useful for this teacher that we can then be working on in our next, lesson observation and then next meeting. And I suppose that comes back to that thing about trust as well, that that was only possible because I'd got a really good working relationship with this person, and we had shared language and shared understanding of process that meant that we could kind of essentially go, right, let's just cut to the chase and go, bang, let's sort that out and let's have a look at that, in a way that I wouldn't want to normally do. But again, it's about, I suppose, having to respond to the reality of busy teaching life, that you can't always do it in this idealized way that you want to, and knowing what you can kind of get away with taking out. I wouldn't say permanently, I wouldn't want that to happen every time, because I think you'd lose the richness of the coaching, but knowing that you can, on a one-off go, okay, right, let's just go, bang, do this, great, off we go, let's try it, and then we'll have a proper chat next time. Sorry, that feels like that's kind of wandered a little away from from the point in the original discussion, but I think it's kind of an interesting one that that there isn't always the luxury of the fully developed conversation that we'd love to have as coaches. So we have to know how to respond to that and still make it a meaningful process.
But I guess there's value in that, isn't there? The fact that, to use your phrase, rubber hitting the road there, is that 15 minutes, it's possible that every fourth session is going to be a 15-minute cut to the chase. Yes, you lose the richness, as you were saying, but there's got to be an advantage to that in the sense that some of this more nebulous stuff is for out of necessity. It's got rid of, this is what we're going to change, let's go, let's do something about it, and then we can have another couple of sessions that are have that richness about them and have that diversity of quality, but that actually out of that kind of the difficulty of you both being time poor, possibly came something good where you were able to focus in on the bread and butter, essentially, of what. At some point,
I might write a blog on it called Speed Coaching, and we'll see if if that goes anywhere. Because I feel like that's what it felt like. It was like, right, we've got this amount of time. What's the most important stuff? Let's do it. It's not something I necessarily advocate, but I think it might be one of those, it's just a necessity in a coach's toolkit to be able to deal with that situation.
And when you're doing, you just ring a bell, hit a bell, and then move on to the next person.
Yeah, and the next one comes in.
Yeah.
Cool.
Well, listen, Paul, I've had a brilliant morning. This isn't usually how our Saturday mornings start. Our Saturday mornings are usually quite leisurely. Adam and I have a writing meeting, and we talk through a load of stuff that we're going to do, and it's going to be really cool. But this has been brilliant, and has really. I've got a nice long weekend ahead of me writing and doing a load of different stuff. So this has properly set me up for quite a productive weekend. So from a personal point of view, thank you very much, because I feel like I'm ready to go.
it's very different to my normal Saturday morning, which typically involves corralling the kids off to the supermarket and doing the weekly shop. So,
I'm glad we could help.
Yeah, I've got to make it up to my wife now, as she's had to wrangle those two small children for the last hour and a half, or however long it's been. So, but yeah, no, that's it. I think it's been really good to like push some thinking and just bounce around ideas. Like you said, it's a conversation. And I'm going to go away and think about a lot of this stuff a lot harder now.
Paul, honestly, thanks so much. It's always an absolute education to talk to you. It's been absolutely fantastic, and we massively appreciate the time. And hopefully we can do some stuff together in the future.
Yeah, sure. If I may, I'm speaking at Research Ed Milton Keynes in a couple of weeks. And doing I'm doing 2 sessions, one with Mike Hobbis on evidence-informed teaching, but I'm doing kind of my coaching talk, which I'm probably going to have to go away and rewrite a little bit off now on like some of these conversations. But yeah, so if anyone happens to be listening who happens to be going and wants to come and chat more about coaching, please do. I will absolutely be presenting my version of this is what I think, but it's not the right answer, but this is where I'm at the moment. And trying to make, I can put Venn diagrams on a screen then rather than talking about them with waving my arms in the air. So,
like,
amazing.
Definitely, if you're going to Research Ed Milton Keynes, go and see Paul. Like, honestly, it's brilliant. We saw him at Research Ed National, and it's absolutely fantastic. The humility that he speaks with, and just the curiosity that he speaks with, is really, really empowering for anybody that gets to listen to him. And also read his blog. So if you go and watch him, like, read his blogs before, I would say, because they're so informative and like so well thought out. So yeah, highly.
Do your homework, guys. Do your homework. Research it and then go and enjoy. Paul, thank you so much.
Thank you.
And hopefully speak to you soon. Thank you so much for tuning in to the latest episode of the EduPulse podcast. Why not help broaden the conversation and join us over on social media at EduPulse Co, or sign up to our newsletter at edupulse.co, and we'll see you next time.